to see the whole title at the top, or is it covered by the black bar?
No, we have all the image.
You have the entire image. Splendid. So allow me to make a start. I should like to talk about the music of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, transcriptions and harmonisations. And I would like to start by thanking you all, and particularly Svetlana, for your kindness in inviting me to contribute in my own way in honouring the memory of Father Ivan Moody, whom we all esteemed so much and whom we very much miss. And in this connection, I should like first to justify my choice of topic, because one of my last conversations with Father Ivan was when he very kindly phoned me to say that he had been asked by the Gramophone magazine to write a review of a new recording of the Armenian Divine Liturgy in the arrangement by Komitas, and he very kindly sought my opinion on various aspects of it, which I was glad to share. As it happens, I had some knowledge of that particular recording as well, and it is so characteristic of the man that the review, when it appeared, and he kindly shared it with me, was at the same time perceptive, truthful, but also very encouraging and very, very gracious. So I thought that it would be appropriate to choose this as my topic, because it is related to a conversation that we had still relatively recently. We have to start with the 12th century because we have concrete information about authors of the melodies used in the Armenian Divine Liturgy from that time, and the greatest of those is Saint Nersēs the Gracious, the 850th anniversary of whose passing was noted this last year. And we hear that he endowed the various parts of the liturgy with sweet melodies appropriate to the mystery of the sacrament. He rendered decorous the mysterious chants of the holy sacrifice, and his aim was to make human minds more receptive to the mystery. And I wish to mention Saint Nersēs the Gracious for yet another reason, which is that in the summer of 2023, in fact a year ago, come to think of it, Father Ivan very kindly advised me on my English translations of a number of the saints' hymns, and it seems that he liked those texts so very much that he asked me to send the complete collection that I had prepared, as he would very much like to set some of the words himself, and I gladly sent them to him. Alas, we can only imagine what those settings might have been. Circumstances did not allow him to realize this object. Now, there are some uncertainties about the authorship of some of the items, because the new items, as we might describe them, and define them by the fact that they are not yet found in the commentary by Khosrov Anzevatsi in the 10th century, but they are mentioned in the commentary from the 12th century by Saint Nersēs Lamprodat. These are new. We cannot, however, be sure that everything that is new in this sense is necessarily due to Saint Nersēs the Gracious. These are quite complex technical problems. My late teacher, Archbishop Zezere Arts Festival of blessed memory, did some work on this, and I too have published on this very, very recently. We shall bypass those things at the moment. I should just like to show some early numated sources. This being a codex kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, copied in Cilicia on 1241, and in this instance, as on many others, you find that the scribe has himself, as I'm trying to indicate with this red arrow, referred to particular chants and attributed them to Lord Nersēs the Catholicos of the Armenians, Catholicos being the word to denote head of the army. And I decided to examine the numations of some of those chants attributable to the saint across a 150-year period. So my second manuscript from Venice is a little bit later, and my third one from Vienna is slightly later still, and I tried to copy the news of certain characteristic items, and it is interesting what we found. If we look at the Sanctus, surp, the first syllable thereof, which you can see on the top left-hand side, you see that the melisma found on the first surp, in fact in the case of the second manuscript I've considered the second one as well because there isn't much of melisma on the first syllable, and the third manuscript, these have changed very considerably. And the Lord's Prayer, evidently it was sung in various different ways. I don't know whether these coexisted or whether we have snapshots of a consistent development, but you can see that the neumes are substantially different for those items, the ancient hymn Sanctus and the Lord's Prayer. But when it comes to those two items on the bottom here on the left-hand side and this other item on the right-hand side, both of which are commonly attributed to Saint Nersēs the Gracious, we find that the neumes have remained quite invariant across this period. Now, this in itself need not necessarily guarantee that church musicians sang the same melodies. They could have sung other things whilst looking at the unchanged neumes, but it seems to me that it is quite significant that such was the veneration for the saint and the respect in which he was held, that it seems that no one dared change the neumes associated with those components of the Divine Liturgy that he had composed. And before we move on, I should like to mention another hymn for which we know of a concrete author, in fact, both historians of the period, but also the acrostic of this hymn. In other words, if you consider the very first letter of each stanza together, they form his name, Haig of Daron, the abbot of the monastery of Haig Utidjian that you can see in the photograph and which is still standing today in Armenia. Well, apparently there was a field mass early in the 13th century in northern Armenia in Lori, and on this occasion, Haig of Daron stood up and sang for the very first time his hymn, Chorin, O Mystery Deep, to which I shall have cause to return on several occasions in this talk. So this is one further instance where we know of a concrete author, not only author of the words, but the composer of the melody at the time, although we can be a little less sure about that because we have certain complications. We have a group of hymns that bear the same numations, you could say, more or less contrafacta of one another, and it is up here which is the oldest of those. And of course, the melodies that have reached us at present are highly unlikely to be those that were sung in the medieval period. But that is another thing. What then are the melodies that we do have at our disposal? We are sadly unable to read the Armenian neumes, but we do possess a rich corpus of extant melodies, most of which were transcribed in the 19th century either in Western staff notation or using the Limongian Peshishian notational system, the new Armenian notation system that emerged around the year 1812, and which is no longer pneumatic, but rather it redefines some of the signs of a medieval pneumatic system, giving them completely new values, resulting in a system that is comparable to, in case you're familiar with it, the Greek so-called lesbian system invented by Georgios Lesbios, whereby each particular sign denotes a particular note of a given pitch with a system of additional signs to denote rhythm. and other means of elevating the pitch by a small amount or indicating higher or lower octaves. And I shall proceed then to consider two things. First of all, transcriptions of the melodies of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, and then harmonized choral arrangements of those melodies. Now, in terms of transcriptions, we have transcriptions starting from the 1860s that have reached us. Certainly, they were made by the Italian Venetian musician Pietro Bianchini from the chanting of the fathers on the island of San Lazzaro in Venice. And at about the same time, the chants of the Mekhitarist Monastery, the branch in Vienna, were also published. All this in Western staff notation, but we also have Constantinopolitan melodies that were published in Bahar Shabbat in Armenia, H.Utidjian, and although that is in the Caucasus, this was instigated and carried out largely by Constantinopolitan Armenian church musicians using the Limogian notation. So in all probability, and there is evidence for it, the high proportion of those melodies are not Caucasian, but Constantinopolitan. An independent branch of the tradition was actually transcribed during the turn of the century in, of all places, Calcutta. There was a substantial Armenian population at the time, although it was waning at that time, and that tradition is associated with New Julfa as well. And a special case is Jerusalem, because we know from various descriptions that there was an independent tradition of melodies there, but sadly, because notation, be it the Limogian notation or Western staff notation, came rather late, it appears that all their melodies peculiar to the place have been largely lost. My colleague Haig Utidjian very recently published a manuscript that was copied, or which the process of copying which started before the genocide in the year 1914 and it was completed in 1970. So this would have been just before the greatest influx of musicians from Constantinople and other refugees from historical Armenia. Nonetheless, my inspection of this material suggests that there was substantial Constantinopolitan influence, although it's not entirely homogeneous and every single item of this rather expensive manuscript deserves to be examined properly, something that I have not yet. And I can show you some of the covers of these volumes. So the first two items are Venice, 1862, 1877, Vienna also in 1877. Then we have the Bahar Shabbat transcriptions in the Limogian notation in Armenia proper, in H.Utidjian. On the right-hand side, you see the earlier of two versions of the Calcutta publications, and then Constantinople. The middle item is Jerusalem, and on the right-hand side is a later unpublished manuscript version, again from San Lazzaro. It has been great fun trying to compare with earlier transcriptions by Bianchini. Again, it's very useful to have several snapshots representing what may have been sung at different times, although again one has to be careful because certain things may have coexisted for a long time and just been transcribed at different times. It does not necessarily mean that melody A transformed itself into melody B and so forth. And finally, tantalizingly, we do have little bits and pieces, fragments of the music of the Divine Liturgy, transcribed by various people, in one instance by my late teacher in Cyprus, who has a melody of Sebast, as he has described it. I'm not sure if he just copied it or whether he transcribed it whilst listening to it being sung, but this melody is not otherwise attested. It is exceedingly interesting, and had not copied it or transcribed it, we would have been completely ignorant of the existence of this melody. And I shall now turn to arrangements of those melodies. And to make those more manageable to us, and to try and systematize things a little bit, I've divided them into 4 groups. The first group consists of items which we knew existed and were performed, but which seem not to have reached us. And interestingly enough, one was by the Ukrainian playwright and poet, who was also a musician, Marko Kropivnitsky, apparently performed in 1873 in Ackerman in the Ukraine, but its deployment was apparently forbidden by the conservative Bishop of Bessarabia, and I have not been able to locate it or find anyone who has seen it, but we know it exists. My second group is harmonisations by gifted enthusiasts. These were usually practitioners of Armenian church music, but who did not have any Western training in harmony or counterpoint. So, these tend to be sadly ungrammatical. Nonetheless, here and there you find a certain sense of freshness, a certain exciting feeling, a certain sense of discovery, because those musicians were hearing melodies that they knew well for the first time in 3 parts or 4 parts. And yes, you get consecutive intervals and exposed fifths and all those things, but you sometimes their naive harmonizations have a certain charm. I can have occasion to play you a little example from this category. The third category is also perhaps rather problematic. There are versions made by Western professional musicians with limited experience of the idiom, and who had to make somehow sense of the melodies available to them with their highly unfamiliar modality. All sorts of metrical irregularities, as well as melismas and ornaments that had to be transcribed with very, very small note values, with a kind of law of diminishing returns, because the more precisely one tries to transcribe something that may have been improvised, or which sounds as if it was improvised at that moment, the more difficult it is to reproduce it without its sounding wooden and calculated and artificial, which are the very qualities you want to avoid because they have no place in the style. And microtonal characteristics, for which they did not have the notational equipment at the time, as well as coping with the highly inconsistent singing of those church musicians who sang either from memory or by gazing upon the by now largely incomprehensible music. And yet, one of those musicians, Pietro Bianchini, was a highly gifted Italian composer with a real instinct and love for Armenian sacred music, and his transcriptions as well as harmonizations are valuable and very, very interesting, and they have been neglected, including by the Mekhitarist fathers themselves, sadly. My last category consists of versions by mature Armenian musicians who did possess both Western training as well as direct experience of Armenian chanting, and whose versions had ambitious artistic aspirations, although they were intended also for liturgical use. So Ekmalian's version, he studied in St. Petersburg. Archimandrite Komitas studied in Berlin. Father Moses Sarabian studied in Vienna. Arab Artevnian was a pupil of Vincent d'Indy in France. And so these were musicians who were much more confident about what they were doing on both counts. The 2 popular versions that are still in regular liturgical use are the Ekmalian and the Komitas versions. But before we start looking at those, it is also behovely to mention that there are original settings as well, although they are generally not used liturgically. And except there are particular excerpts, certain items in the Divine Liturgy, which it has been traditionally acceptable for a long time for people to compose, often with the same words undergoing successive waves of composition and recomposition. Sometimes such items conform to traditional classical Ottoman makams. Often we don't even know who composed such items. But we also have complete original settings of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, but I will not be dealing with this in my present talk. Rather, I want to start by talking a little bit about the reaction to harmonization, because reactions, as you might imagine, were rather mixed, and it is interesting to consider those. And as my first example, I shall use Kara-Murza, who was a gifted Armenian musician, but who lacked a Western training, and he produced more than one version. The first version was performed on Easter Day in 1886 in Baku, in one of the Armenian churches there. But within 4 years, its deployment was forbidden by the local bishop, and there's a very amusing incident that I cannot resist narrating to you. The bishop apparently asked Kara-Murza first to get his choir to perform his harmonized version, and then to repeat the chants of the Divine Liturgy in unison. And he said, the choice is clear, it sounds much better in unison, you will not be permitted to perform your harmonization anymore. And Kara-Murza took offense, and a few days later, during an evening liturgy, when in the customary manner he was passing on a candelabrum bearing 4 candles to the bishop, he extinguished 3 of the 4 candles. And when the bishop said, "Why on earth are you giving me this candelabrum with only a single candle?" He said, "That is exactly what you're doing by insisting that we hear those chants in a single voice and not in harmonized versions of 3 or 4 voices." Nonetheless, Kara-Murza was invited to become director of music of the Mother See, and Archimandrite Komitas, who was at that time a very young deacon and a soloist in his choir, apparently was very conservative, and he protested to his teacher and choirmaster, saying, "God is one, music too should be in a single voice." And of course, Kara-Murza responded to him saying, "Why do you forget that God is the union of 3 persons?" There were other objections. The church is a holy place, not a theatre. And Kara-Murza was born a Catholic, and this was something that was criticized. May the composer go to his Catholic comrades and propagate his harmonized versions there. God is one, singing should be in one voice, polyphony is appropriate to polytheism, or it is peculiar to the Catholic tradition and against the traditions of the Armenian Orthodox. Now, the Catholicos, the head of the Armenian Church, was succeeded by another person who actually dismissed him with the ironic words, "You are a great master, very useful to the nation. The work you have started is good work, but the seminary walls are too narrow for it." Nonetheless, interestingly enough, the Catholicos shortly after dismissing Kara-Murza, permitted the young Komitas to conduct certain 4-part items within the liturgy. Although that also met with criticism, and in this case it was said that his liturgy reeks of Protestant. And yet, very soon, the Catholicos Chimian authorized also Ekmalian's harmonization by means of a formal bull, which was published in the score, and later on, one of his successors, Catholicos Kevork V, likewise approved of Amy Apkar's harmonized version. So the obstacles appear to have been overcome. Now, when it came to the Bianchini transcriptions and harmonizations on the island of San Lazzaro in Venice, I had assumed that the Mekhitarists, who were always a bridge between East and West and were open to European culture and progressive, would have embraced Bianchini's work without reservation. but a newly discovered set of letters written by Bianchini in the years from 1855 to 1857 give a much more interesting and nuanced picture. This is one of them, which I was able to translate with the help of my good friend Dr. Giuseppe Sanfratello. And in a sense, we are fortunate that there were objections, because they made it necessary for Bianchini to write those beautifully written letters in which he explains some of the pragmatic considerations, aesthetics and theology, which he evoked to persuade those of the Mekhitarist Brotherhood who were reluctant or even opposed. His first appeal is pragmatic, and it appeals to the patriotic inclinations of the Mekhitarist mission, saying that if everything is properly regulated, harmonized, and well performed, it will be acknowledged that in fact Armenian ecclesiastic chant is not inferior to Gregorian chant, but perhaps in certain points even surpasses it. And the other main argument, which we find repeated decades later by Ekmalian, is that music is the queen of science, which was born to harmonize the praises of the Most High. And music being as a sort of pleasing sacrifice, pleasing incense to God, will surely be more pleasing should we offer it to him in accordance with the most perfected state of the art. And in fact, we find more or less the same argumentation in the preface to the 1896 score of the Ekmalian version published by Breitkopf and Hertel in Leipzig, with the words furnished by the Mekhitarist fathers of Vienna. And in addition, the Ekmalian had an advantage over Bianchini. Ekmalian had also impeccable credentials in the field of Armenian sacred music. He was one of those young people who assisted in the transcriptions in the Limondjian notation in 1887 of the new music of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, so he could not be criticized on that score. And his Western credentials were also excellent, and in fact a panel from the St. Petersburg Conservatoire attested that the harmonisations were of high quality. And interestingly, he stresses that he deliberately avoided any sort of chromaticism and endeavored to maintain simplicity so that the original melodies, which he reproduced unaltered, would shine through. Now, Ekmalian's former pupil, Komitas, as a young archimandrite, wrote a highly critical review of the Ekmalian harmonization, in my view, in some ways unnecessarily critical. This review and critique is valuable primarily because it serves as a manifesto about Komitas's own ideas. And he says he would like to create his own arrangement in which it is essential that the stresses of language and melody kiss each other. I'm sure that this is a reference to Psalm 85 or Psalm 84 in the Armenian version and in the Greek Septuagint. Mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other. And he wrote, he desired to create a version of the Divine Liturgy that strove towards perfection and is planned as an artistic unity. And now I should like to do one thing. The hymn I mentioned, which was sung at an open-air mass by Khachadur of Daron centuries earlier, in its 19th century transcription, doubtless a very different melody from what may have been sung then. Nonetheless, the version transcribed in the Limondjian notation in the Harshabat, that melody was used equally by Ekmalian and Komitas, but they treated the melody very differently, and I should like you now briefly to hear, you must forgive my piano playing, the very different effect that the two arrangements have. We start with Ekmalian and we proceed with Komitas, just the beginning of that hymn. Orurthorin, O mystery dear. And now I will proceed to play you a short hymn from the Divine Liturgy, Marmin Derunagan, the Body of the Lord. First, in the versions by Karamurza, as I said, a gifted enthusiast, sense of freshness of discovery, but not really very grammatical, nonetheless naive and touching in its own way. Then Ekmalian's noble and simple version, and then two variants, both undertaken by Komitas, of which the second one is especially hauntingly beautiful and harmonically adventurous, inhabiting, in my view, more of the world of Schoenberg's Second Chamber Symphony, Benjamin Britten's Rejoice in the Lamb, or Franck Martin's Petite Symphonie Concertante. But we start first with the rather naive harmonization by Karamurza. Another version by Ekmalian, noble in its simplicity. Now the first of the Komitas versions. And now finally listen to the Komitas' highly sophisticated version that I find most interesting, extremely beautiful, hauntingly beautiful, and ahead of its time, of the same chant, exactly the same melody. note as the tonal axis, and also he modulates to a different tonality. This is an example of what he meant about the entire Divine Liturgy being a sort of unity conceived as a single coherent item. That's where we start and that's where we end up. I should like to conclude by very briefly singing, but actually this is pre-recorded with some friends of mine, an ode that is performed in the Divine Liturgy when the celebrant is a bishop or of higher rank, and the melody itself is also one that we would not have had not Komitas recorded it. And I should like, as a little flavor, to play you that in conclusion, and I will show you both the score published in 1933 and the rather neat autograph of Komitas. Sadly, not everything is so neatly written out. We have only a few pages of the Komitas version of Divine Liturgy in fair copy. Most of it is a draft, such as what you see on the left-hand side. It's a processional hymn sung during the Divine Liturgy. On the right-hand side, we have the fair copy of it, but there are other things similar in appearance to the example on the left, for which we don't have fair copies. There are a lot of editorial problems and sketches to be studied, but that's not an aspect that I'm able to cover in the time available to me. Both Pietro Bianchini and Archimandrite Komitas had a profound love and understanding of the melodies of the Armenian Divine Liturgy. Komitas was convinced somehow that if he manages to work his way backwards into the more distant past, he will find melodies, original melodies, celestial and pure melodies. Bianchini was more satisfied by the melodies that he heard in Venice, and he was eager that they should be presented in a suitable manner, and he left instructions for his singers, saying that if you observe the right rules of the art of interpreting this music, then those melodies have the power to render or rather, this art has the power to render those chants sublime, celestial, and at once most pleasing to our hearts and to our ears. I should like to thank all those organizations and individuals who have been helpful to me in my research, and not least Professor Svetlana Polyakova for honoring me by allowing me to offer my own very modest tribute to Father Ivan this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Haig. It was impressive. And you honored our conference too. Thank you. Do we have some questions? Yes, or if you...
Hello, Haig. Thank you so much for the paper. It's Alexander Lingus. So, yeah, I think once again you've added to the picture here and showing how close the parallels are with the development of things on the Greek side as well, with the polemics, which parallel very closely those against polyphony. So I'm just looking forward to an opportunity to exploring those parallels with you.
Thank you so much, dear Alexander. There are indeed parallels and contradistinctions, but we have more or less arrived at the same place, it seems to me. I've enjoyed so much performances by Capella Romana in multiple voices. But one thing in the case of the Armenian Church is that the standards of performance are not always what one might wish, and one would be happier if things were done simply. The other consideration is that all these arrangements, of course, contributed to the disappearance of microtonal nuances, that there's so much evidence to demonstrate that it was part of the tradition, and in fact, early recordings attest to this as well. But I very much share your desire to compare notes about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just make a little question? I know Ivan was very interested in all these discussions. And how do you, sorry if it's a naive question, but how do you see his hypothetical, never we will know, but his hypothetical work with the Armenian material?
It's one of so many reasons why I mourn his premature passing. Because I'm sure whatever he would have done, and I cannot possibly guess what it would have been like, as has been said today, he was so versatile, so many styles. He would have surprised us in a delightful way, and if only Providence had granted him a little more time so that he could realize his wish. You can't imagine how delighted I was when he said that he wanted me to send him the words because he felt inspired to do something with them. But it is one of those things that we shall perhaps hear when we are in a better place in Upper Jerusalem, but not in this world.
Yes. So thank you very much. Thank you, Haig. And now we